thank you once again for joining. A reminder, please do type your questions in the chat box when you hear an interesting point that you'd like to challenge or question. And I'm ready to hand over to our first speaker. So I'm pleased to introduce Sandeep Chamlangrai. Sandeep is the Senior Advisor on Global Climate Adaptation Policy at WWF International Climate and Energy Programme based out of the Singapore office. He leads WWF's global efforts on climate change adaptation and loss and damage policy and practice. Sandeep has participated in the UNFCCC process in various capacities with WWF and with the Nepalese government delegations. He is one of the members of the non-economic losses expert group under the Warsaw International Mechanism. Thank you, and I hand over to Sandeep.
Thank you, Colin, and good afternoon, everybody. May I request Sunil to make this slide, to present my slide in the screen. While this slide is coming, so firstly, thank you so much, everyone, for joining our events today. And as Colin mentioned, we are talking about the climate change vulnerability in the regions and how that needs to be better integrated in the UNFCCC process. So my presentation is mostly on the introductory slide. I will be really talking about from the climate change vulnerability from the particular regions, from the Asia-Pacific regions, and what are some of the challenges and opportunities, as well as the need for the region. Sunil, is this slide up? Well, I think we have some technical glitch. I think that's fine. So why don't and while Sunil is fixing this slide, why don't I start my intervention, because the time is running away. So in terms of the vulnerability, I would say, in terms of the vulnerability, what we see in the region is that we are just about 1.1 degree above the pre-industrial level, but still the climate change vulnerability is really high, especially what we have recently seen, let's say, the tropical cyclone and in the Fiji, or we are talking about the cyclone, yes, that hit the south, let's say, Indian coast, or also the typhoon and Goni that hit the Philippines some time ago. So the disaster is really happening and everywhere, and right now, even I think, as we have already seen in a couple of medias and news, there is a lot of heat wave in North America and also in Europe, especially in the Scandinavian countries. So impact is happening everywhere, and every time the impact is really escalating, I think in much more alarming rate. And the Asia-Pacific region is highly vulnerable because there are many, I would say, countries who are in the low-lying state. For example, when we talk about the Kiribati countries, which are, or let's say Maldives, who are just between 1 and 2 meters above sea level rise. There are many, I would say, cities who are concentrated in the coastal zones, and many of this region. Agriculture is really rain-fed agriculture, which also brings additional vulnerability from the climate change. And the topography of the region is quite, I would say, diverse, because most of the I would say countries are in the high elevation, from all the way to mountains to the low-lying state. And so that also adds additional vulnerability as well. But I just want to highlight the 2 points what we had seen. It was in 2018 when the World Bank had put forward their I would say report on climate induced migration, so which really talks about by 2050 140 million people will migrate in the territory and outside, especially in the 3 continents, and Asia Pacific, or I would say the South Asia is one of that I would say vulnerable continent, and many of these I would say, and those vulnerabilities is basically due to lack of fresh water availability, the food security, and the extreme weather events. So next slide, please. Yeah, this one. Yeah, and in terms of the other report also really highlights about the the Red Cross and Red Cross Christian has put forward a report earlier this year, which really talks about in the last let's say 10 years, more than 410 people have died due to weather-related or climate-induced disaster, and almost 1.7 billion people around the world were affected by the climate-related disaster in the last 1 decade. So that's quite alarming. Next one, please. And in terms of preparation, so if you look this particular slide, and so over here I really try to highlight in terms of where are the various countries really putting in the preparation of their adaptation planning. So if you look in your left-hand slide, where the 40 countries in the Asia-Pacific regions are in the process of preparing their national adaptation plan. But there are only few, maybe 4 or 5 of those countries that really submitted their national adaptation plan to the UNFCCC. This is as of December 2020. And within the Asia-Pacific region, so far, if you look at the access the finance from the GCF to getting resources from the GCF, there were 20 proposals submitted to the GCF. However, only 13 of them has been approved and 11 of them has been in the implementation phase. So there is quite, I would say, quite issue on accessing the funding from GCF for the preparation and implementation of the national adaptation plan. But however, if you look about how many of the Asia-Pacific countries had submitted their revised NDC, the below graph really highlights in terms of the NDC, the revised NDC submitted to the UNFCCC. I think there are many countries that needs to be done. Still, this is ongoing, and many countries are in the process of I would say enhancing their NDC and submitting to the UNFCCC. So the deadline is coming up for the NDC enhancement, so that must go up. Next one, please. Next slide. And in terms of, let me highlight in terms of challenges, opportunities, and needs. So when we talk about the challenges, I would say if you look from the whole the Asia-Pacific region, addressing of climate change challenges is especially in the context of the goalpost is always changing, especially to address the climate change, because every time the impact is really exceeding compared to the past one, and in many cases, and many countries are already really moving into the uncharted territory of how to address the climate impact, and that is quite, I would say, quite a thing to address. So the goalpost of climate impact is always changing, whereas many of the impacts are much more escalating in a rapid way, that many countries are really struggling to adapt with those impacts. And on top of that, COVID-19 has really brought the additional challenges to the many countries in the region, and especially those who are already suffering from the climate change, and that is adding on top of that. However, some of the opportunity what I see from the Asia-Pacific region is that Asia-Pacific region can be a global hub for the various innovation approach on how to build climate resilience at the local level or at the grassroots level. Either we talk about the building resilience on the food sector or food resilience, or also deploying some of the innovative approaches at the scale level, not at the project level, but more at the scale level, at the land scale level, whether we talk about the ecosystem based or we talk about the nature based solution. And the other panel which will highlight it a bit more on that part, but these are some of the opportunity what we can really see that the Asia-Pacific can offer. And so the resilience infrastructure, the infrastructure also needs to be resilient, and those things can be really be done at the Asia-Pacific region. And in terms of the, I would say, the lack of scientific data, those challenges as well as the need, especially the lack of scientific data, the human resources, the technical as well as the financial resources are some of the key, I would say, need for the Asia-Pacific region. So in nutshell, I would say the COP26 need to adopt a decision and take a decision that is very consultative and a transparent process, and that needs to really engage all the relevant key stakeholders and take a decision that really adds value on building climate resilience in the Asia-Pacific region. So last one slide, please. And finally, in conclusion, Finally, in the conclusion, let me highlight. Finally, in the conclusion, let me also address that. That despite the climate impacts happening in the SFX region, building climate resilience is also key, especially in the scale that is needed. And despite the mitigation and adaptation effort that is taking around the world, there is also there will be losses and damages in the Asia-Pacific region, where the country needs to really experience that and need to address that within the planning processes. And Asia-Pacific has a lot of opportunity to contribute on climate resilient effort, and the lesson learned from the Asia-Pacific region can be replicated into other continent, and all the Asia-Pacific region are undertaking the adaptation planning processes. But on top of that, the finance, especially the scale, the sources, and how to access the finance will be the key challenges to expedite the adaptation action in the region. So lastly, with the COVID-19 that might stay for quite some time, and also with the COP26 approaching really soon, the COP can be either go in a full phase or in the hybrid COP. But the COP26 president needs to engage with all relevant stakeholders and adopt an outcome that's really contributes in building climate resilience of the vulnerable sector, and that will be a strong legacy of the UK presidency. And in some cases, I would say the UK presidency is really trying to do a lot in terms of engaging with relevant stakeholders, visiting those countries and other things. But there's a lot to be done, and I hope the UK presidency will really take that step much more bold and be able to take a strong decision that will be a legacy of the UK presidency on building climate resilience, not only in the Asia-Pacific region, but to all developing countries. So let me stop there, and sorry for all this technical glitch that is happening today. So back to you, Colin. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sandeep. And I will desperately try and multitask, which is something that I'm not particularly good at. But thank you very much for that excellent presentation. Clearly, you've highlighted that climate change is already having an impact on people and nature across the Asia-Pacific region. The countries of the region are in a varied state of preparedness, both in terms of developing national adaptation plans, including nature into those national adaptation plans, and developing NDCs, their commitments to deliver on the Paris Agreement. You highlighted that there is a real need for increased capacity, increased research in the region to better understand these hazards, the uncertainty. There is a challenge around finance at the scale that is necessary, and also access to those financial sources. And finally, I think I made an excellent call to the COP26 presidency team that this is a potential moment to establish a legacy, given the difficult conditions under which the negotiations will be taking place. Now is the moment for the COP26 team to reach out to countries, to engage countries in full and meaningful dialogues, so that whether the COP takes place fully in person, as a hybrid event, or as an online event, the voices of this region, the Asia-Pacific region, are being heard. So thank you very much, Sandeep. I will now pass on to Kriti Shrestha, who is the Knowledge Officer for the Zurich Flood Resilience Alliance at Practical Action in Nepal. And Kriti has an environmental degree, a degree in environmental science, and over 10 years experience in climate change, environmental impacts and policy advocacy. Kriti's interests lie in community-based adaptation, policy and governance research, vulnerability assessment, disaster risk reduction, adaptation planning, technology transfer, and participatory action research. And if I can just check, do you want me to share the slides, Kriti? You do?
Yes,
okay.
Yes, thank you.
One moment while I get the slides up. Right. There you go.
Thank you so much, Colleen. Namaste and good afternoon to everyone. Like Colleen has said, Practical Action as a part of Zurich Flood Resilience Alliance works with communities in southern Nepal to help them find practical ways to strengthen their resilience. Now, please do note that these are the communities that are at the forefront of floods, and they are leading their resilience building themselves. We at Practical Action are only facilitating them with knowledge and expertise we have developed over the years through helping them measure their resilience through tools such as flood resilience measurement for communities. We also work with governments at various levels, at national level, at local level, and at provincial level to help find ways that can help enable these communities to build their resilience. And we also have an extensive knowledge repository we call flood resilience portals that are in various languages that helps practitioners and researchers who work in disaster risk reduction and management and also in floods. So we focus on floods as floods affect more people than other hazards, and the frequency and intensity of floods is expected to increase in coming years. In our work, we focus on building flood resilience, strengthening flood resilience, so that communities can pursue their economic, social, and ecological development in a way that they can manage their disaster risk over time, and both the goals mutually reinforces each other. And through our work, we focus primarily on prevention and preparedness because we believe that every $1 invested in prevention helps save $5 in future losses. So we therefore work with communities and governments to prioritize disaster preparedness and prevention activities. Colin, can we move to the next slide? So in prevention, we focus on low-cost, community-managed, and nature-based solutions mostly to prevent floods. So these nature-based solutions basically help to protect, manage, and restore ecosystems so that the societal challenges are addressed effectively, and also they have benefits in terms of human well-being and biodiversity. One such example that we have been doing in our communities are biodikes. So biodikes are basically a bioengineering solutions that helps to manage floodwaters, and control floodwater movement. It is a culmination of biological, mechanical, as well as ecological concepts that helps to stabilize the riverbank slopes and is useful when there is no immediate need for larger engineering works or when communities cannot afford large engineering structures. So biodikes are better because they get stable and are stronger over time. They use locally available materials, and they also provide biodiversity benefits to the communities once they are fully grown and stabilized. So this particular example that I will be discussing now is of Bangalipur community, where we built biodikes in phase 1. So before the biodikes were there, for the past 15 years, the communities had been seriously affected by floods. There was a serious land erosion there, and they had lost almost around 2 hectares of land prior to building the biodikes. So this was almost equal to 10 families, some of whom have completely lost their agriculture land and their livelihoods. So after the biodikes, it has been easier for the communities because the erosion has stopped. And then and another good thing about this is that when we were building the biodikes, uh, around every household, from every household, sorry, I think there's a background noise. So anyways, so 2 people from each household worked for 25 days and contributed to the construction of biodikes. So recently, apart from this biodike, we have also recently built another biodike in Dakshinpur community. And during that construction, the local municipality or rural municipality has contributed around 3 lakh Nepali rupees. And along with that, the community itself has contributed around 1.2 lakhs through community contributions. So if you look at the total cost of around 14 lakhs, it is the government contribution alone makes around 21%. So this is a beautiful example of how the knowledge and advocacy that we have been doing in nature-based solutions has brought together communities and local governments to invest in building resilience. Can we move to the next slide, Colin? So all these activities that we are doing at the community level, we are doing through our community disaster management committees, so which are basically our grassroots level organizations that foster community engagement and leadership when it comes to disaster risk reduction and management. So their chief purpose is to take actions for disaster risk reductions and disaster preparedness, response and recovery, and also serve as the key entry points for local governments as well as practitioners to work for disaster risk reduction and management. So this example that I would like to go deep into is of Chakhapur community, where Ms. Karuna Chaudhary, she is a housewife, she is a mother of a toddler, and she is the chairperson of the CDMC there. And she has been actively chairing her CDMC since 8 years. And she has been very strongly for strengthening the resilience of her community over these years. So it's interesting how she started as a CDMC chairperson, because in one of our conversations, she shared that when the CDMC had been started, there was no one ready to be the chairperson, and then she was chosen because by default. But then over time, she has worked hard, and then she has gained respect not only of her community members, but also from the local governments as well as other stakeholders. So even in this, in the last monsoon and in this monsoon, she has been working actively to build her community's resilience and preparedness, not only for monsoon, but also for COVID-related awareness campaigns. So these two examples show that, changes are happening on the ground. Communities are more engaged than before, and then they are leading their communities, strengthening their resilience. And the communities are getting more inclusive when it comes to building resilience. And these two cases and other cases that are in our communities are classic examples of resilience for all, by all. So there are many examples, where women from indigenous and marginalized communities have been leading their communities towards resilience. But then, and that there are also examples where local governments and stakeholders have been investing in climate resilience because both communities and local governments are working together to invest in climate resilience. So, but then these changes, while they are welcome at the ground, these are not enough. If we look at the impacts of floods of 2017, more than 190,000 households have been affected, and many of them were homeless. Many communities had suffered from food shortages over time and lack of access to clean drinking water, and there were various recurrent infections that came post-floods. Now, these 190,000 households are not just numbers. These are people. These are actual people, actual families who have suffered year after year by floods. And I think this is something we have to keep in mind, that these numbers are people, that these numbers are families, when we are talking about, climate resilience at a COP scale or at a global scale. I think this is something that should guide our actions and our priorities. Now, we conducted, can we move to the next slide, Colleen? Right. So we conducted a study last year. We tried to look at how climate-induced disaster funding scenario is developing in Nepal. We tried to look at where do these funds come from, how are they spent, and do they reach the vulnerable communities or not, or so on and so forth. The results were not very good. One finding showed that our total financing in the past 17 years, that is around 66.5 billion rupees, was equal to the total cost of estimated losses of 2017 floods. So we do know where the gap is. There's a huge gap. Similarly, another finding from the study showed that the governments, out of the total spending that the government of Nepal has done, 84% of the spending goes to post-disaster interventions. So the government has clearly prioritized post-disaster interventions over prevention and preparedness. So this will create more discrepancy in the future, and this is something that we have to bring the change in. Refocus government's priority towards prevention and preparedness. So that is something that we have to think of when we are talking about discussions and all that. So similarly, another finding that came out of the study was, despite the funding that government has allocated on post-disaster, not all the funding reaches the vulnerable communities. There are many, because of the various hurdles when it comes to bureaucratic channels, unclarities in process, especially at subnational level. So not a lot of funding has been reaching to the most poor, most vulnerable, and most marginalized communities. So that is another challenge that was highlighted by the study. Similarly, the climate disaster budget, the study has analyzed that the climate disaster budget has been insufficient in the past and will not be sufficient if we look at the midterm, for example, 2025 or the long-term 2030 gaps. There are also various changes that needs to be done in governance and institutional practices if we are to bring justice and equity and more access to the funding. So this is the big disconnect, all these big processes and negotiations that we're talking about that are for the communities who are living with floods year after year, who are living at the forefront of all these climate-induced disasters. And we should all remember this because disasters have a human face. And while we are talking about COP, when we're talking about negotiations, when we're talking about accessing more climate finance, we have to keep these people in our mind. And these people are doing incredible job at community level. These communities are doing incredible job when it comes to building resilience. So these are the examples that should guide our discussions, that should guide our priority, and that should guide our actions when we're talking there. So I think this is something that we need to think when we're talking about COP26, and we also need to know that the work that the communities are doing at the ground level are welcome but not enough, and then we should all create enabling environment for them to access more climate finance, to access to have enabling policy environments and all. I would like to stop here. Thank you, Colleen. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Kriti, for your excellent presentation. And I will desperately try and catch up. So thank you very much for your presentation. Clearly, the area where you're working, floods are increasing. And you've been working to sort of explore how to bring resilience to those communities. And I think the way you articulated it, resilience for all by all, is really a key message from this experience. Clearly, development and climate change adaptation centered on these communities is vital. We need to engage these communities in active dialogues to understand what their context is, what their aspirations are, what their needs are. And I particularly like the point that you made about the unsung heroes, the people in these communities that need our help and need our support. And most importantly, it's not just these numbers. It's not just numbers that are important. It's people, families, communities, and we need to ensure that these all have an input to guide the COP process going forward. So thank you very much, Kriti. And it's now my pleasure to introduce Nung Pham Kam. Nung Pham is the Climate and Energy Practice Lead of WWF Viet Nam. Nung has a background in environment, technology and resource management and has worked on environmental protection for over 18 years. She has been with WWF Viet Nam for 10 years, specifically working on policy advocacy, climate resilience and sustainable energy promotion and their application in Vietnam. So I'm pleased to hand over to Nung for her presentation. Take it away. Thank you.
Thank you, Colin. I'm sharing the screen, so can you see it now?
Yes, we can see the screen. Could you put it on? That's it. Perfect. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, so thank you very much. I'm honored to present our experience on the ground on how the NBS builds a climate resilient and what is the opportunity and constraints in Vietnam. So firstly, I want to introduce you about our climate. The climate impacts in the country. So we do have the latest scenario on climate change in the country developed last month, and it shows that the temperature can increase by 3.3 to 4 Celsius degrees, and the rainfall can increase from 5 to 15%, while the sea level rise, from 73 to 100 centimeters by the end of century. And with the sea level rise, we have a very high risk of inundation in both the delta in Red River in the north and the Mekong Delta in the south Vietnam. So what is the impact of climate change on the nature and the biodiversity? So with the serious impact of climate change, we see the degradation of the mangrove system and it will lead to the frequent forest fire in country. The loss of mangrove also lead to the impact of the coastal fishing community. They are more vulnerable to the extreme event. With the sea level rise, we also face with a problem of the saltwater intrusions. And in the meantime, we also have the serious intrusions of mangrove forests. It's about 300 square kilometer and correspondent to about 17% of the total nature mangrove forest area. So for the impact of the climate change, we also see the degradation of the quality of the forest resources and of the biodiversity. We affect seriously to the poor, the women, and the minority groups who are dependent on the forestry practice. And I think also one of the serious impacts of the climate change is the loss of biodiversity we occurs in both, I think, freshwater and marines. So what we are doing on the ground, so we do have a different, I think, pilots and programs in the country on the ground. One example we're doing in Ben Tre province, one of the southern province in Viet Nam. So we look at the different areas, different sectors, and relevant policy, where is what the EBA or an NBS measure can be integrated. So you can see on the table that is a different sector from nature resource and environment management, the biodiversity conservation, the land use planning and investment, and agriculture, and the I think the relevant policy I think to include the sector and how we can integrate the EBA measures into those policy, and who are responsible to implement the policy and the measure. So for example, for biodiversity conservation, we have the province conservation plan, and we propose I think the recommendation measures of EBA, such as establish the new protected area, create the green corridor, and strengthen law enforcement. So from I think the piloting and program on the ground, so we identify the 4 important steps to implement the NBS and EBAs at the grassroots level. So which is I think which are the first one is we need to assess vulnerability, the assessment of social and ecology system. The second one, we need to identify and prioritize the NBS and EBA response. The next step is implement and monitoring NBS and EBA response. And the last one, how we can mainstream EBA and NBS into the national and local climate change planning. So to do that, we need to consider the different areas, but the most area we need to consider and to implement, that is we need to assess the climate change risk vulnerability as the appropriate scale of intervention. The second step we need to do is we need to identify the ecosystem service and its beneficiaries. We can select by the sector or by group of people, and how they can increase the resilience of vulnerable sector and community. So it can also get to, and we need to also to get understanding of the link between the current and future climate change, the national development priority, and how EBA can contribute to the development priority. And then we have to identify the priority area for EBA based on our assessment of climate risks and the development of priorities. And also one important point we have to do, that is assess the governmental, political, and institutional settings that includes the climate change topics. So how the EBA and NBS can build our climate resilience? So it can build on the assistance capacity and the effort on the natural resource management. The the EBA and NBS can offer our different solutions that considers a low or no risk solution. For example, we can, improve the forest or water access management. It also recognizes the connectivity between the vulnerability of the ecosystem and the vulnerability of the community due to the climate change. NBS and EBA will support our development of adaptation strategy, which would be custom-made and recognize the value of ecosystem service in building the human resilience to respond to climate change. And I think the NBA and NBS also require two ways of flow of the knowledge transfer, including, I think, the local knowledge from the community, and the second is the scientific data and information. So what is the opportunity for us on EBA and EBS? So EBA and NBS will support the government to achieve our both mitigation and adaptation target in NDC. I think the second one, Vietnam as one of the Southeast Asia country, and also other country, is the most vulnerable regions to the impact of climate change, and it would enjoy an outside benefit from robust investment in the nature-based solution. So EBS is also one of 5 primary teams focus on the road to the COP26 this year. And also we can see the NBS have the capacity to address the challenge by fostering the synergy among the SDG goals. What is the constraints we see the NBS in the country now? That is a limited knowledge base for NBS, in particular the proof how the NBS to build the climate resilient in the short term, because we see a lot of different solutions. NBS have more long-term effective. The second constraint, we see the difficulties in the measuring effectiveness. For example, the reduction of the impact of flood arising through the increasing precipitation is influenced by many interacting context-specific factors, and it's very difficult to measure it. I think the third constraint is carbon removal through the NBS can be impermanent and reversible with the future climate change due to the fair or the past change in the management regime or the ecosystem collapse. The next constraint we face is the lack of investment in the NBS. We see about only 5% of finance for the climate change issue, but in which only less than 1% for the coastal protection and disaster, and including the NBS. Another constraint is the challenge to governance the NBS in the country, because the NBS solution normally is a multi-action across the landscape or seascape or across the boundary, and it's a need to involve a different authority from the local, from regional, and from the national level, and also from the different ministry to participate. So it's a very challenge in governance. I think the last constraint we highlight here is NBS we need to apply in tandem with other measures to reduce the pressures on the land, like the chain to food, dietary agricultural system. Otherwise, we face with the land use conflicts. So I end my presentation here, and thank you very much for your listening. Over to Colin.
Thank you very much, Nung. That was an excellent introduction to climate change impacts, and nature and people in Vietnam. Clearly, climate impacts in Vietnam are increasing. You highlighted temperature, rainfall, and sea level rise, and that these are having direct and indirect impacts on people and nature. It's leading to degradation of natural systems and erosion of ecosystem services. You highlighted the integration between ecosystem-based adaptation and nature-based solutions, and the fact that WWF Vietnam has been working on developing a four-step process that involves vulnerability assessments, prioritized responses, implementation, and then mainstreaming. And then you really discussed some of the reasons of how mainstreaming, taking to scale these solutions can work, and some of the constraints that we face. You highlighted that we really need to be clear in terms of the links between current and future climate change and the national development strategies and plans. You highlighted that in many cases, nature-based solutions offer no regret solutions. They offer co-benefits for people and nature, and they could potentially deliver massive national benefits if there was wide-scale investment in them. But there are numerous constraints, and you highlighted the lack and limits of knowledge, the proof of their effectiveness, which is resulting in limited investment, and you also highlighted the challenges around effective governance of nature-based solutions. So thank you very much, Nung, for your excellent presentation. Now we shift tack away from countries and projects to the big picture. So thank you, Krishnil Narayan, who has joined us to share how bringing Southern voices into the negotiating process can and must be enhanced. Krishnil is a sustainable development consultant with economic, environmental and social change experience based in Fiji. He is the director and principal consultant at Sustainable Futures Consultancy and is a certified expert in climate adaptation finance. He is an experienced UN climate change negotiator who has contributed to the adoption of the Water International Mechanism for Loss and Damage back in 2013 and also the Paris Agreement in 2015. He worked closely with governments, development agencies, NGOs and the private sector to formulate development action plans for the region. So thank you, Krishnil, over to you.
Thanks, Colin. And thanks for having me here today to share my inputs around how bringing Southern voices into the UNFCCC process can be enhanced, especially in the global pandemic context, and learning from the previous COP experiences on how community voices and non-state actors were able to inform and enrich the climate debate at previous COPs. So I first got involved in the UNFCCC process about 14 years ago as a youth, fresh out of the university, because at the time we realized that in a process that talks about our sustainable future, the voices of the young Pacific Islanders were not at all represented. So I took upon myself to mobilize youth voices of the Pacific small island developing states within the UNFCCC space. So I just wanted to share this time some of that experience. So at the time, young people were still not seen by the government officials doing the climate negotiations, or government officials in the process are known as parties in the UNFCCC language. The young people were seen as a tokenistic engagement group who don't really contribute to the complex international negotiation process led by the governments. So we were told we are the future, and one day we will take over the baton over from the current officials in the negotiation rooms. And in a way, we were being told, yes, one day, but that day is not today or anytime soon. So I thought, like, if I'm going to do something, if I can do something, I can focus my energy in my own country officials to include youth voices in more efficiently in the UNFCCC processes. And this required years of work because it involved changing their mindset about young people's role in the process. And eventually I was included in the party government delegations and contributed to supporting the Pacific Island governments in negotiating issues as a party negotiator leading up to the Paris Agreement. So I have seen the UNFCCC space from both sides, as an observer with the NGOs lobbying governments from the outside, and also as part of the government delegations influencing the negotiation processes directly from within. Pre-COVID times, not just civil society representatives and local voices, but also government party delegations from the many developing countries, particularly those from the smaller countries, struggle to participate effectively in the process. While larger countries got big delegations up to 100 people, small island countries like Fiji, Kiribati, Tuvalu, Cook Islands could only field up to 5 to 10 officials to participate in 24 negotiation streams, taking at the same time. So it has been a struggle for many years. Now with COVID-19 restrictions in the mix, it poses even more challenges. But these challenges also mean it is time for the UNFCCC negotiation process to adapt just like those on the climate front lines. Civil society and community voices are often restricted to climate action areas of the venues at COP in what is known as the green zone, where a space is provided to host events, share stories, and best practices, while the official negotiations by the governments occurs in a separate venue known as the blue zone. Those government officials are often bureaucrats who don't directly work with the impacted countries, just like those stories we have heard from the earlier speakers. When Fiji was the president of COP23 back in 2017, we used to meet with the Fiji presidency regularly to ensure that civil society voices and community actors voices were considered in the planning process. So this required probably meeting about twice a month, get an update from the presidency side around what they're planning and see how we can interlink and support those voices in ensuring that no one is left behind when such an important process was led for the very first time by Fiji, and Fiji being was the first country, small island country that had ever led the presidency of a COP process. So at COP23, some of the NGOs assisted village headmen or the chief of the village from one of the villages, that got relocated in Fiji to attend COP and share their experiences. We organized in partnership with the COP presidencies a number of events that focused on local stories from the communities, and also showcased initiatives that form partnerships between various sectors like governments, private sector, and community-led activities. Of course, this sharing of experiences happened in the action space or the green zone, separate from where the government negotiations were taking place. And because negotiations in the COP process are so hectic and time-consuming, and not all government officials are able to participate in those green zone processes spaces. So this separation from local experience, the separation of local experiences from the actual negotiations often has me questioning the setup of the process. We need to focus on getting the local community voices to be part of the official government delegations to inform the bureaucrats in making informed decisions in the UNFCCC process, because that is where the key decisions are made that actually matter. These local lived experiences and knowledge generated in these communities must inform the broader climate resilience discourse to take the work under the Paris Agreement forward. There are also initiatives that focus on getting more women negotiators to participate in the COP processes, but those fundings have gone to female government officials. We need to open up those opportunities to women from the affected communities on the climate front lines to also be provided those funding and participate effectively in the process, so that the voices of the women from the climate front lines can be enhanced and included in the process. We also need to there's a need to set up training programs that focus on building the capacity of young people from the developing countries to effectively negotiate in the new UNFCCC process and support their countries in pushing for a faster action needed to address climate change. And in facilitating that those training programs, you will also build the capacity of the smaller developing countries teams to effectively negotiate in the process, and in turn enhancing the voices from the southern countries or developing countries to actively negotiate in the process. we have been encouraging the COP26 presidency to provide a hybrid in-person and virtual COP26 participation process, because many developing countries are still struggling to contain COVID-19. It will present a challenge for those developing countries to travel to COP26 and attend it in person. A hybrid virtual and in-person COP will allow us to reach more people who traditionally would not be able to travel to COP to attend such events. Such people as the local community actors who usually don't have much funding to travel long distances to attend COPs. Online, the whole world is a potential audience, with audiences larger and more diverse than the traditionally possible people who participate at COPs. So should a hybrid setup be confirmed by the COP26 presidents in the weeks ahead, larger international NGOs could assist in setting up local hubs in the developing countries where they have offices, to provide a space with good internet access so that local community experiences can be provided an opportunity to participate virtually. So let me end by sharing that this week here in the Pacific Climate Resilience Meeting is taking place virtually, bringing together a vast range of actors from across the Pacific region to discuss resilience from climate change and disaster risk. During those sessions this week, we have heard that inclusion of local experiences promotes development. Effective inclusion promotes community, and resilience is no longer an aspiration, it is a necessity. So I will stop there because of time, and happy to take on any questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Krishnil, for your excellent discussion of your experience of bringing Southern voices into the negotiating process. I think the experience you shared of engaging national governments to listen to more diverse voices, how to bring young people into the negotiation process is extremely valuable, both as an observer but also as a party negotiator, for highlighting that even before COVID, we had a disparity in the negotiating teams. These big teams of several hundred versus the smaller teams of 5 to 10, maybe 20 negotiators, attempting to cover several hundred negotiating streams all at the same time. The importance of leaving no one behind, village chief participation at COP when Fiji was the president, highlighting the separation between the blue and the green zones, the general public versus the bureaucrats, the need for more women in the negotiating process, not just government officials, but also community voices, the need for training, and then your recommendations on a hybrid in-person and virtual negotiating platform, which would allow more people to participate. It could generate much bigger audiences to actually engage in the process, and this recommendation to set up local hubs in developing countries. I think there are a lot of very good suggestions there. Now, I ask my fellow presenters to switch on your cameras. We have just a final couple of minutes left in the session, so I would just ask you really to reflect on what has been presented in this session this morning, and maybe what would be your recommendations if you had 5 minutes, or if you had 30 seconds with Alok Sharma. What would be your key message to the UK president? So maybe Sandeep, I'll go through in the order that you've spoken. So Sandeep, would you like to go first?
Sure, thank you. I think that's a very good question. What I would say is that, look, what's happening on what's adopt a COP decision that really miss the purpose of the Paris Agreement in terms of reducing the vulnerability reducing the vulnerability and safeguarding the vulnerable sector of the population and the ecosystem. So that could be my key one takeaway message. But while I'm on there is a very good question in the chat, Colin, if I want to very quickly touch on that. because the question is really relevant. It talks about the nature-based solution at scale requires large land, which can bring conflict from a landowner. So just to highlight that nature-based solution doesn't only mean about plantation of the trees and others. There are many other different I would say, scope of nature-based solution which may not have a conflict with the landowner. For example, mangrove plantation along the coastal zones, the coral, I would say, plantation of the coral reef and others. These are some of the examples, and what Noon also presented in a slide also gives there are various examples of nature-based solutions that doesn't really conflict with the landowners. But having said that, those kind of nature-based solution intervention at the protected areas or the conservation areas needs to be really taken into consideration of the I would say the land ownership as well. That needs to be an integral part of the debate on the NBS at scale level. But just to highlight that nature-based solution is not only about the plantation of the trees. There are many other activities that can be done, and there are many examples that we can see from the nature-based solution at the field scape level. So let me stop there.
Thank you very much, Sandeep. So, Kriti, if you had 30-second lift pitch presentation to Alok Sharma, what would you want to say to him? Thank you.
Two words, Colin. People first. Put people in the limelight, put people in the priority, learn from the cases, learn from the successes that are at the ground level, highlight those cases at the COP level, and then manage more funds so that it can reach to the communities so that they can upscale their adaptation and climate resilience activities.
Thank you very much, Kriti.
Thank you.
Thank you. Nung, what would be your 30-second pitch to the president, COP26 president?
Yeah, so from Vietnam, we see the importance of NBS, highlighting the policies and how we can mobilize the funding to implement it. The participant of the community of the Seattle and other different non-state actors is very important for the country to achieve the climate change target, including the NBS. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much, Nung. And Krishneel, over to you.
I think my colleagues earlier have said a lot touched on finance, and I think in my intervention I talked about the need for effective participation and inclusion at COP26. So I guess I'd use my 30 seconds to re-highlight that.
Thank you very much, Krishneel. And we did have one other question on the investment gap in the Nepal presentation. It is the investment gap. Kriti, do you want to answer the question?
Yes, so that investment gap is the government budget. The government on budget amount from the past 17 years and not of practical action. And the study has come up with key recommendations that include setting up a climate-induced disaster budget at the national level where international donors and countries can put in the resources, and then having a good channel at subnational level from where these financing can aptly reach the most poor and vulnerable and marginalized communities. And there have been recommendations to improve the bureaucratic channels from where these funding flows, and also improve the tracking and monitoring mechanisms. So these are the key highlights of the study, and that would be, I think that answers what he has asked.
Thank you very much, Kriti. Thank you very much to all of the speakers, Sandeep, Kriti, Nung and Krishneel, for an excellent session. We will have a recording of the session and we'll be posting it online. We will send the link to everybody who registered and participated in the event. If you have any further questions, don't hesitate to reach out to any of us. The registration link, I think you can connect with the coordinator on the registration link, and look forward to seeing you in future events at Asia Pacific Climate Week. Thank you very much, everybody, and see you all soon. Goodbye.
Yeah. Thank you, Colin, and thanks,
Thank you all. Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.